The morning my fiancée looked at the ring I had saved for and chosen with trembling hands, wrinkled her nose, called it pathetic, and walked out of the restaurant without looking back, I felt something inside me break and something else quietly settle into place, because for the first time in 11 months of loving her, I finally knew the truth about who she really was, and she had no idea that the man she just humiliated in front of a rooftop full of strangers owned the very building she was storming out of. Before we go further into this story, if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and the idea that people can still surprise us in the best and worst ways, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel. Stories like this one mean so much more when they're shared within our community, so thank you for being here with our family today. My name doesn't matter as much as what I learned that afternoon on the rooftop, but for the sake of this story, you can call me Grant Ellison, because that was the name I used with almost everyone outside of my boardrooms and my accountants. I was 34 years old, and by the time this story takes place, I had built a technology company from a garage apartment with a leaking roof into something worth more money than I ever thought a human being could reasonably need. I don't say that to brag. I say it because it's the reason this story happened the way it did, and because for years, that money had become less of a gift and more of a quiet, constant fear that lived behind my ribs. I grew up in a small house on the edge of a town most people have never heard of, raised by my mother, Eleanor, who worked double shifts at a roadside diner so that I could have new shoes in the fall and a warm coat in the winter. My father left before I could form a memory of his face, and so my entire understanding of what love was supposed to look like came from watching my mother come home exhausted, smelling like coffee and fryer oil, and still find the energy to sit with me at the kitchen table and ask about my day like it was the most important thing in the world. She used to tell me that money could buy comfort but never character, and that the day I forgot that lesson would be the day I lost myself. I didn't understand her then. I understood her completely by the time I was 34, sitting across from a woman who had just called a $3,000 ring pathetic. I built my company in my 20s, during the kind of years where you sleep 4 hours a night and convince yourself it's temporary. It wasn't temporary. It became my entire life, and slowly, without my noticing, it became the only relationship I trusted, because software doesn't lie to you and a spreadsheet doesn't pretend to love you for reasons it doesn't actually feel. By the time the company sold its majority stake to a larger firm and my net worth became a number I genuinely struggled to say out loud without feeling nauseous, I had already learned the hard way that money changes how people look at you. I had dated women in my late 20s and early 30s who seemed wonderful until the moment they discovered what my bank account looked like, and then their eyes would change in a way I can only describe as a light switching on behind them, calculating, measuring, recalculating. I stopped telling people what I did for a living. I told them I worked in project management for a tech consulting firm, which was technically not a lie, since I did, in fact, manage a great many projects. I drove a modest car. I lived in a comfortable but unremarkable apartment I kept for exactly this purpose, even though I owned 3 other properties I rarely mentioned. I built an entire second life out of caution, and I hated that I had to, but I hated the alternative more. I met Vivian Sterling at a charity gala I had been dragged to by my closest friend, a wiry, sharp-tongued man named Marcus Doyle, who had known me since we were both broke and hungry and dreaming too big for 2 boys from nowhere towns. Vivian was luminous that night, the kind of beautiful that made an entire room recalibrate itself around her, and when she laughed at something I said near the dessert table, it felt like being handed something rare. She told me she worked in marketing for a boutique firm, and when I told her I did project management, she smiled and said she liked a man who wasn't trying to impress her with his job title. I remember thinking, in that moment, that maybe I had finally found someone who saw past the noise. I know now how foolish that hope was, but hope rarely announces itself as foolish while you're standing inside of it. We dated for nearly a year. Vivian was charming in the way a perfectly tailored coat is charming, it fits so well you don't think to ask what it's covering. She had opinions about restaurants and hotels and the right neighborhoods, opinions I initially mistook for taste and later understood were something closer to hunger. Small things began to accumulate the way small things always do before they become impossible to ignore. She once refused to enter a diner I suggested because she said the vinyl booths reminded her of people who never left their hometown, and I remember the sentence landing somewhere deep in my chest, because my mother had spent 30 years of her life inside booths exactly like those. I told myself she didn't mean it the way it sounded. I told myself a lot of things that year. There was a night, maybe 4 months before the proposal, when Vivian and I were watching the news together and a story came on about a local businessman who had quietly donated a significant sum to a children's hospital wing without ever wanting his name attached to the donation. Vivian scoffed and said that was the stupidest thing she'd ever heard, that if she had that kind of money she would want the whole world to know exactly how generous and important she was. I remember looking at her profile in the blue light of the television and feeling, for the first time, a small cold stone settle in my stomach. I didn't say anything. I told myself people say careless things when they're comfortable and joking. I told myself a great many things. It was around that time that I began, quietly and without fully admitting it to myself, testing her. Not maliciously. Not as a game designed to hurt anyone. I simply started paying closer attention, the way you check the foundation of a house you're about to spend the rest of your life inside of. I let her believe I was stretched thin some months, mentioning a tight budget here and there, watching to see whether her affection wavered when the appearance of scarcity entered our conversations. I noticed she grew slightly cooler on the weeks I claimed money was tight, and slightly warmer on the weeks I mentioned bonuses or good news at work. I told myself I was imagining a pattern where there was none. Marcus, who had met her exactly twice, pulled me aside after the second meeting and told me, in his blunt and loving way, that something about her felt like a woman auditioning for a role rather than living a life. I brushed him off. I told him he didn't know her the way I did. Looking back, I think I said that because some quiet, honest part of me was terrified he was right. I decided, in the end, that I needed to know for certain, not because I wanted to trap her, but because I had spent too many years of my life being loved for the wrong reasons and I could not bear to build a marriage on a foundation I hadn't tested with my own hands. So I planned a proposal on the rooftop terrace of a restaurant downtown, a beautiful space with a glass railing and a view of the river, a restaurant I happened to own the entire building beneath, though she never knew that either. I chose a ring that was lovely, well-made, with a modest round diamond set in white gold, purchased for $3,000 from a small independent jeweler I had come to know and respect over the years, a woman named Rosalind who had built her business from nothing and who cried a little when I told her what the ring was for. I could have bought a ring worth more than most houses. I chose not to, because I needed to see, with total clarity, whether Vivian Sterling loved the man across the table from her or the idea of a life she believed he could eventually provide. The afternoon itself was bright and warm, early autumn sunlight spilling gold across the white tablecloths, the kind of day that seems to promise good things simply by existing. Vivian arrived in a pale blue dress, her hair loose around her shoulders, and she looked so genuinely happy to see me that for one small, aching moment I let myself believe everything would be fine, that I had been unfair to her in my quiet suspicions, that love really could be this simple after all. We ate lunch and talked about nothing important, and when the plates were cleared, I reached into my jacket pocket and felt the small velvet box against my fingers, and my heart was pounding the way it does before something enormous and irreversible. I got down on one knee in front of her, in front of the other diners on that rooftop, in front of the wide blue sky, and I told her that she had made me happier than I ever expected to be, that I wanted to build a life with her, that I wanted to grow old beside her. I opened the box. The ring caught the sunlight and threw a small, honest sparkle across the white tablecloth. And Vivian Sterling's face did something I will never forget for the rest of my life. It didn't light up. It didn't crumple with tears of joy. It went very still, and then very cold, in a way that made the whole rooftop feel 10 degrees colder around us. She picked up the box, turned it over once in her fingers as though checking a price tag she couldn't quite believe, and asked me, in a voice loud enough for the nearby tables to hear, whether this was some kind of joke. I told her, confused, that I didn't understand. She said, And I remember every word of this with a clarity I wish I didn't have, that she had been with me for almost a year, that she had introduced me to her friends and her family, that she had built an entire future in her head, and that I had the audacity to hand her a pathetic $3,000 ring like she was some ordinary girl from some ordinary town who should be grateful for whatever scraps a man decided to give her. She said she deserved better than this. She said a man like me should be embarrassed to even present something so small. And then she stood up, dropped the ring box onto the table with a small, sharp clatter, and walked toward the elevator, her heels clicking against the stone in a rhythm that felt, to me, like a countdown. I sat there, kneeling, in front of strangers who had gone quiet with second-hand embarrassment on my behalf, and I felt the strangest mixture of heartbreak and relief wash through me at the same time, the way a wound and its healing can sometimes arrive together. My chest ached with the loss of the woman I had believed her to be for 11 months. And underneath that ache, quieter but unmistakable, was a kind of grim gratitude, because I finally had my answer, delivered in the clearest possible terms, and I had not wasted a lifetime finding it out. Marcus found out within the hour, because of course he did, because gossip travels faster in this city than light. He came to my apartment that evening with 2 coffees, since he knew I didn't drink, and he sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same kind of plain wooden table my mother used to have, and he didn't say, "I told you so," which I will always be grateful for, because I don't think I could have survived hearing it that night. Instead he asked me how I was feeling, and I told him the truth, which was that I didn't fully know yet, that grief and relief were tangled together in my chest like 2 vines growing around the same fence post, impossible to separate without damaging both. I called my mother 2 days later. Eleanor was 71 by then, retired from the diner but still sharp as broken glass, still living in the same small house I grew up in because she refused every offer I made to move her somewhere grander, insisting that the house held too many good memories to abandon for marble countertops. When I told her what happened, she was quiet for a long moment, and then she said something I have carried with me every day since. She said that heartbreak feels like the end of the world only because we mistake the death of an illusion for the death of a possibility, and that somewhere out there was a woman who would have looked at that same $3,000 ring and seen not its price but the hand that had chosen it, the thought behind it, the love inside it. She told me not to let Vivian's smallness convince me that love itself was small. I cried on the phone with my mother that night in a way I hadn't cried since I was a boy, and she let me, the way she always had, without rushing me toward being fine before I actually was. The weeks that followed were strange in the way that all sudden emptiness is strange. I threw myself back into work, into the foundation my company had quietly built to fund scholarships for kids from towns like the one I grew up in, kids who needed someone to believe in them the way no one had needed to believe in me twice, because I had done the believing for myself out of sheer necessity. I told myself I was fine. I told myself a lot of things during those weeks, most of which weren't entirely true, but which I needed to say out loud to keep moving forward one ordinary day at a time. It was on one of those ordinary days, nearly 2 months after the rooftop, that I walked into a small diner not far from my old apartment, a place with cracked vinyl booths and a bell above the door that jingled slightly off-key, because I had a sudden, aching craving for the kind of food my mother used to bring home from her shifts, and because some part of me needed to sit somewhere that felt honest. The diner was called the Marigold, run by an older couple who had owned it for over 20 years, and behind the counter that afternoon was a young woman with dark auburn hair pulled back into a loose bun, wearing an apron dusted with flour, laughing at something an elderly customer had said. Her name, I would learn within the hour, was Josephine Hart, though everyone who knew her called her Josie. I sat at the counter, and Josie came over with a coffee pot in one hand and a genuine, unhurried smile on her face, the kind of smile that isn't performing for anyone, and she asked what I'd like, and something about the ease of the moment, the total absence of calculation in her eyes, made my shoulders drop for the first time in weeks. I ordered eggs and toast, the same thing I used to order as a boy, and while she poured my coffee, she noticed the small scar on my knuckle, a leftover from a bicycle accident when I was 9, and asked, with genuine curiosity rather than idle small talk, how I'd gotten it. I told her the story, badly and with too much detail, and she laughed in a way that made the whole diner feel warmer. I came back to the Marigold the next week, and the week after that, and somewhere in the accumulation of ordinary Tuesday afternoons, I found myself looking forward to those visits more than almost anything else in my carefully constructed, carefully guarded life. Josie never asked me what I did for a living beyond my mention of project work, and she never seemed to care much either way, which I noticed, and which I valued more than she could have known. She talked instead about the community garden she volunteered at on weekends, about the after-school reading program she ran for kids in the neighborhood whose parents worked long shifts and couldn't always be there in the afternoons, about her younger brother who was studying to become a nurse and how proud she was of him even though she teased him mercilessly about it. She talked about her life like it was already full and good, not like it was a waiting room for something better to arrive. One afternoon, several weeks into our unlikely friendship, I finally worked up the nerve to ask if she'd like to get dinner sometime, somewhere other than across a diner counter, and she said yes with an easy directness that startled me, because I had grown so used to romantic interest arriving wrapped in strategy that I had almost forgotten what simple, uncomplicated yes sounded like. Our first real date was nothing extraordinary by the standards I had once lived inside of. We walked along the river in the late afternoon sun, ate sandwiches from a cart, and talked for 3 hours about nothing that mattered and everything that did. She told me about losing her father when she was 19, about how it had taught her that time was the only currency that actually meant anything, and I told her, haltingly, about my own father's absence, about my mother's diner shifts, about the fear that had followed me out of that small house and into every relationship I had built since. I didn't tell her about the company. I didn't tell her about the buildings or the accounts or the number that sat behind my name like a shadow I couldn't outrun. I told myself I was protecting the fragile, honest thing growing between us. I know now that some part of me was also protecting myself, terrified of watching her eyes change the way I had watched other eyes change before. Around this same time, nearly 3 months after the rooftop, Vivian resurfaced. It happened the way these things often do in a city small enough for gossip to travel in circles. One of my old business associates had mentioned, at a dinner I hadn't attended, that the project manager Vivian had once dated was, in fact, the majority owner of a technology company that had recently been the subject of a large financial news story. The story had detailed a sale, a number, a name, and apparently a photograph that made its way to Vivian within days. She called me on a Thursday afternoon, her voice honeyed in a way I hadn't heard directed at me in months, saying she'd been thinking about me, that she'd made a terrible mistake, that she'd been overwhelmed that day on the rooftop and said things she didn't mean, that she wanted to talk, to explain, to start over. I sat with the phone against my ear for a long moment before answering, and I felt none of the ache I had expected to feel. I felt, instead, a strange and clarifying calm, the kind that arrives when a question you've carried for a long time is finally, completely answered. I told her, as gently as I could manage, that I understood why she was calling, that I even understood the impulse behind it, but that nothing had actually changed about who I was between that rooftop afternoon and this phone call, only her understanding of what I had. I told her that was precisely the problem, and precisely the answer I had needed, painful as it had been to receive it the way I had. She grew angry then, accused me of manipulating her with the modest ring, of setting some kind of trap, and I told her, honestly, that I hadn't set a trap so much as asked a question, and that she had answered it herself, in front of witnesses, without any prompting from me at all. I wished her well. I meant it. And then I ended the call, and something in my chest that had been clenched tight for months finally, quietly, released. I want to pause here and say something honestly, because I think it matters more than almost anything else in this story. Forgiving Vivian did not mean welcoming her back. I did forgive her, eventually, in the way my mother had taught me forgiveness works, not as a reward for the other person, but as a release for yourself, a way of setting down a weight you were never meant to carry forever. I stopped being angry at her sometime that winter. I even, strangely, felt a kind of sadness on her behalf, imagining a life spent measuring love by its price tag, always hungry, never quite satisfied, no matter how much arrived. But forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same door, and I had learned, at considerable cost, which door I was willing to walk back through and which one I needed to leave closed for good. My relationship with Josie deepened slowly, the way good things tend to, without the urgency or performance that had characterized my time with Vivian. We spent Saturday mornings at the community garden, where I learned, embarrassingly late in life, how to tell a weed from a seedling, and where Josie introduced me to an elderly widower named Harold who tended a small plot of tomatoes in memory of his late wife and who told me, unprompted, that the secret to a long marriage was choosing, every single day, to see the person in front of you rather than the person you wished they'd become. We spent Tuesday evenings at her after-school reading program, where I found myself, a man who had once negotiated multi-million-dollar acquisitions without breaking a sweat, more nervous than I had been in years, trying to help an 8-year-old boy named Desmond sound out the word extraordinary from a picture book about a boy who could fly. Something about watching Josie kneel down to a child's eye level, patient and warm and utterly present, cracked something open in me that I hadn't known was still sealed shut. It was nearly 5 months into our relationship, on a bright Sunday afternoon in early spring, that I finally told her the truth. We were sitting on a blanket near the river, the same river we'd walked along on our first date, and she was telling me about a dream she'd had of opening her own small bakery someday, something modest, something that smelled like cinnamon and felt like home to the people who walked through the door. I watched her talk about that dream with such uncomplicated joy, no calculation in her eyes about what it might cost or who might fund it, only the pure shape of the wanting itself, and I knew I couldn't keep the truth from her any longer, not because I feared losing her if I waited, but because she deserved to know the whole of me, not just the carefully edited version I had offered the world for years. I told her everything. I told her about the company, about the sale, about the number that followed my name in the financial papers, about the apartment I kept plain on purpose and the car I drove that cost less than her brother's nursing school tuition. I told her about Vivian, about the rooftop, about the ring I had chosen deliberately modest as a test I hadn't been proud of but hadn't known how else to conduct. I watched her face carefully as I spoke, bracing myself, half expecting to see that familiar light switch on behind her eyes, that recalculation I had learned to recognize and dread. It didn't happen. Instead, Josie was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the river, and then she asked me, with a directness I had come to love in her, why I hadn't told her sooner, not with anger but with something closer to hurt, and I understood immediately that the hurt wasn't about the money at all. It was about the hiding. She told me she didn't care what my bank account looked like, that she had fallen for a man who helped an 8-year-old sound out big words on a Tuesday evening, who didn't know a weed from a seedling but showed up anyway, who told her about his mother's diner shifts like they were sacred, and that the only thing that actually scared her was the idea that I hadn't trusted her enough to be honest. I told her I understood completely, that the hiding had never been about her, that it had been armor I'd built long before I ever knew she existed, armor I hadn't yet learned how to safely set down. She reached over and took my hand, and told me that she hoped, someday, I'd feel safe enough not to need it anymore. I remember thinking, in that moment, that I had never in my life felt more thoroughly and completely seen. Word did eventually get around, as it always does, and Josie's life changed in small ways she hadn't asked for, reporters occasionally lingering outside the marigold, distant acquaintances suddenly remembering her name, a few unkind comments online from strangers who assumed she must be after something. She weathered all of it with the same steady grace I had come to expect from her, and if anything, the attention only clarified things further, because it gave her the chance to prove, again and again, in small daily ways, that nothing about her had changed with the knowledge of my wealth. She still worked her shifts at the diner. She still ran her reading program on Tuesdays. She still refused, gently but firmly, when I offered to simply buy the diner for her outright, telling me that she wanted to build her bakery herself, brick by brick, the way her father had taught her anything worth having was built, and that she'd welcome my support but not my rescue. My mother met Josie on a warm afternoon in early summer, and I watched the two of them from across the kitchen table in the house I'd grown up in, watched Eleanor's careful, appraising eyes soften within the first 20 minutes into something like recognition, the particular warmth of one honest person recognizing another. Later that evening, after Josie had gone to check on something in the car, my mother took my hand across the table and told me that Josie reminded her of herself at that age, before life had worn certain edges smooth, and that she hadn't seen me sit so still and so at peace in years. She told me she was proud of me, not for the company or the money or any of the things the world might point to as success, but for having the courage to keep looking for something real after being handed something false, for not letting one rooftop afternoon convince me that love itself was a lie. I think about that conversation often. I think it might be the proudest I have ever felt in my entire life, prouder than any acquisition or headline or number ever made me feel. There is a particular kind of growth that only comes from being profoundly disappointed by someone, and I want to be honest about mine, because I think it matters for anyone listening who has recently had their own rooftop moment, their own instant of watching someone's true face emerge from behind a mask you didn't know they were wearing. For a while after Vivian, I carried a low, persistent suspicion into every new interaction, waiting for the recalculation, expecting the mask to slip on everyone I met. It took Josie's steady, uncomplicated presence, month after month, to slowly teach my nervous system what my mind already logically understood, that one person's smallness does not predict another person's character, that the world is not made entirely of people waiting to be disappointed by, and that staying closed off forever is its own kind of loss, quieter than heartbreak but just as costly. I also had to reckon honestly with the test itself, with the fact that I had used a $3,000 ring as a kind of trap, however gently intentioned, and I spent real time in the months afterward examining whether that impulse had come from wisdom or from wound. I think, in the end, it was both. I think a person who has been loved falsely enough times develops a reasonable caution, and I don't believe there was anything wrong with wanting to know, before committing my entire life to someone, whether she loved the man or the money. But I also came to understand that tests conducted in secret, without the other person's knowledge or consent, carry their own kind of dishonesty, even when the results confirm your worst fears. With Josie, I chose a different path entirely. I chose transparency instead of tests, vulnerability instead of traps, and what I received in return was something Vivian's reaction had never once offered me, not proof extracted through deception, but trust freely given because I had finally been brave enough to ask for it honestly. Autumn arrived again, a full year after the rooftop, and I found myself once more holding a small velvet box, though everything else about the moment felt entirely different. I didn't plan an elaborate rooftop scene this time. I asked Josie to meet me at the Marigold on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, in the same booth where we'd first talked for 3 hours about nothing and everything, with the same slightly off-key bell above the door and the same cracked vinyl seats that had once reminded another woman of everything she wanted to escape and had reminded me, instead, of everything I wanted to return to. I chose a ring that I picked out with Rosalind again, the same jeweler who had cried a little the first time, though this ring cost considerably more, not because I was trying to prove anything to anyone, but because I had come to know Josie well enough to choose something that matched her particular, understated elegance, a ring I believed she would love regardless of what it cost. When I got down on one knee beside our booth, in front of the elderly couple who owned the diner and a few regular customers who had come to recognize us over the past year, Josie's face did the thing I had once hoped, foolishly, that Vivian's would do. It broke open with joy, tears rising immediately to her eyes, one hand pressed against her mouth, and when I opened the box, she didn't look at the ring first at all. She looked at me. She told me later that she barely registered what the ring looked like in that moment, because she was too busy looking at the face of the man offering it, memorizing it, the way you memorize something you never want to forget. She said yes before I had even finished the sentence, and the whole diner erupted into applause, and the owner brought out a round of pie for everyone on the house, and I remember thinking that this small, unglamorous diner, with its off-key bell and its cracked vinyl booths, had somehow become the most beautiful place I had ever stood. We were married the following spring, in the community garden where we'd spent so many Saturday mornings together, beneath an arch Harold had helped build from old wood and climbing roses he'd grown specifically for the occasion. My mother sat in the front row in a pale yellow dress, crying openly and without embarrassment, and Marcus stood beside me as my best man, leaning over just before the ceremony began to whisper that he'd been right about Vivian and wrong about nothing else in his entire life, which made me laugh so hard I nearly ruined the solemn moment before it even began. Josie's brother walked her down the aisle in his crisp nursing school graduation suit, since her father couldn't be there to do it himself, and I watched her approach through a crowd of the people who mattered most in both of our lives, unable to fully believe that this ordinary, extraordinary happiness had actually found its way to me. We used a portion of the money from the company sale, quietly and without press releases, to help Josie open her bakery 2 years later, a small warm place that smelled exactly like cinnamon, exactly like she had once described it on a blanket by the river, and she insisted on paying back every cent of the startup loan herself, on her own schedule, because she wanted the achievement to be hers and not simply something handed to her. We also expanded my mother's old scholarship foundation, renaming it in Eleanor's honor, funding kids from towns like mine who needed someone to believe in them before the world gave them any good reason to believe in themselves. And on quiet Tuesday evenings, when the bakery had closed and the diner down the street had gone dark, Josie and I still sometimes drove over to the after-school reading program together, helping kids sound out big, extraordinary words, because some things, we'd both decided, were worth protecting exactly as they were, unchanged by any amount of money in the world. I think often about that rooftop afternoon, about the sharp clatter of a ring box dropped onto a white tablecloth, about the word pathetic hanging in warm autumn air. For a long time I thought of it only as the worst afternoon of my adult life, and in some ways it still is. But I've come to understand it differently now, with the particular clarity that only distance and healing can provide. That afternoon didn't end anything good. It ended something false, something that had been quietly, patiently waiting to reveal itself all along, and in doing so, it cleared a space in my life for something real to eventually walk through the door of a diner with a slightly off-key bell. I don't know if I would have found Josie, or recognized her when I did, if Vivian hadn't first shown me, in the clearest possible terms, exactly what love was not. Heartbreak, I've learned, is rarely just an ending. Sometimes it's the exact, necessary clearing of a path. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever had your own version of that rooftop afternoon, your own moment of watching someone's true face emerge from behind a mask, I'd love for you to leave a comment below and share what forgiveness and second chances have meant in your own life, because I think we learn the most from each other's honest stories, and this community means more to me than I can easily put into words. Before you go, I want to gently ask you to sit for just a moment with the real lesson at the heart of this story, and if it resonated with you, please leave a comment sharing what stayed with you most, because those words genuinely mean the world to those of us who share these stories. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey. My mother used to tell me that money can buy comfort but never character, and I spent years of my life half believing her and half hoping the world might prove her wrong. It never did. Character was always the only thing that mattered, in the end, the only thing that separated a woman who called a ring pathetic and walked out into the sunlight without looking back from a woman who looked past the ring entirely and saw, instead, the man kneeling in front of her, offering the whole of an honest heart. I hope that if you take nothing else from this story, you'll take this: the right person was never going to measure your worth by the size of what you could give them. They were only ever going to measure it by the size of the heart doing the giving, and if you're patient, and honest, and brave enough to stay open even after you've been hurt, that person has a way of finding their way to you, sometimes in the most ordinary places, on the most ordinary afternoons, exactly when you've stopped expecting them to arrive at all.